My name is Ed Friedman. I think most of you know me who are here. Chair of Friends of Merrymeaning Bay. Thank you all for coming. We'll do a little intro here about the Friends, and then I'll introduce our speaker tonight and hand things over to her. So we are Friends of Merrymeaning Bay. We're a very unique organization that we take a holistic approach to the environment using these 4 tools here: research, advocacy, land conservation, and education. And a few quickies on each of these. Research, we've done a lot with looking at the toxics in the water here using caged freshwater mussels. We've done a really cool circulation study of the bay, which is a really unique body of water in the whole wide world. We're actively doing eagle nest surveys right now in conjunction with U.S. Fish and Wildlife and Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. And I just got some radiocarbon dates back on some more wood out at the site of this old fishing weir out front here in the bay, and they're all prehistoric dates, like 3,600 years ago, which is pretty cool, I think. Advocacy, we let our research inform our advocacy for the most part, and I know some of you on the call know we just had finally a great success in Augusta last week at the Board of Environmental Protection. In an appeal, we brought over upgrading the classification of the Androscoggin River and ensuring certain minimum oxygen standards would be in place for the next 40 years. So that's a rare victory. Education, not doing as much with COVID, but still doing some of it. This is one of the things that we're doing. But we've actually been working with kids at the Bowdoin Central School. And I'll mention now that we have done sort of a live theater history project with them based on the town of Bowdoin. And we are going to be premiering that the night after the next speaker series. So the next speaker series is second Wednesday of May 10th. And this film with the kids, cast of 80 kids, will be on 7 o'clock on May 11th. So stay tuned for that. I'll mention it in the press release as we get closer to the time. Protected, well over 1,000 acres of land around the bay, our focus being on wildlife habitat. And we just completed another conservation easement at the end of last year. And I hope to maybe do some archaeology on that this year. Overlooking the Kennebec River opposite the southern end of Swan Island. If you know people that wanted to attend this, or you think this was a good presentation, we do record it, as I said, and you can find the recordings on the website, on the homepage, scrolling down the right side under education, and it'll be posted within usually a couple of days here. Rest of the series next month, sort of a history focus aside from the kids program. Will be Jay Robbins, who's just a fantastic place-based historian, talking about order in the Palinborough Courthouse, 1761 to now. And some of you know that was one of only, I think, 3 courthouses in Maine early on, there in Machias and down in York. And it's a great building, and it's open to the public. So with that, I'll introduce Louise Roberts, our presenter tonight. She's a lecturer, an assistant professor in marine biology at the University of Liverpool in the UK. Prior to moving back to the UK, Dr. Roberts was a postdoc associate in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences at Cornell University in the lab of Associate Professor Kyle Wickings. While in the US, she was also an adjunct scientist and residence fellow at the Isle of Shoals Marine Lab on Appledore Island. Many of you know is off our southern Maine coast and operated jointly by Cornell and UNH. Her research interests include passive acoustic monitoring of below ground invertebrates, behavioral and sensory ecology, and human impacts both in aquatic and terrestrial systems. Roberts has a PhD in biological sciences from the Institute of Estuarine and Coastal Studies, University of Hull in the UK, and a master's in marine biology from Bangor University, not our Bangor, but the one in the UK. And she's published extensively in the field of anthropogenic sound effects on marine organisms. And I know, Louise, even though tonight's focus is on soil, I do want to ask you about marine effects as well. As you probably know, there's, you know, a lot going on with offshore wind and that. And I imagine floating effects from floating rigs may not be so bad. Certainly if they're dug into the ground, I would guess they have a lot of vibrations associated with them. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to you. And you can start sharing and say a few words if you want there, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Ed. And thanks very much for having me, and hello, everyone. So I'm going to I pre-recorded my talk. The reason I did so is because it's quite late at night here. It's just after midnight. And I live in an apartment block, so I didn't want to disturb my neighbors too much. So I'm playing you my video, and then we can kind of chat and have questions at the end. So I hope that's okay. What I will say is the video has got sounds in. So if you can all be by your sound volume buttons, you may need to turn it up at certain points if it's a little bit too quiet. So just be aware of that. Okay, so with that, I will share my screen. I'll stop my video.
Good evening and many thanks for attending my talk. So today I'll be talking about work which I took at Cornell University, New York State Agricultural Experimental Station, which is now known as Cornell Agritech. And there I was working with Professor Kyle Wickens, and I was there for 3 years. In the last 6 months since accepting this talk, I've actually relocated back to my home country in the UK, to Liverpool, for a faculty position. So I'm no longer at Cornell, I'm now at Liverpool, but we're still working on analysing the data from this project that I'll talk about today. So Kyle's lab at Cornell is a soil arthropod ecology lab which deals with below ground organisms such as insect grubs, earthworms and microarthropods, or springtails as we know them. A lot of our work is dealing with managed turf grass, so that might be the homeowner lawn, recreational fields, cemeteries and golf courses. And the problem of working in turf grass and soils is that we basically can't see the animals below the surface, and so we don't know what's going on without physically sampling our soil. There are some non-invasive ways available to understand presence and distribution of soil animals and also their activity. So for example, at the top right, we can use remote sensing, satellite images to map effects on crops by pests, or to measure weather and habitat conditions. We can measure chemical cues from plants known as volatiles, and we can also work out what's there by using DNA metabarcoding. Another potential method of non-invasively monitoring an area is to use sound. In the painting here, which is from our Acoustics Today article, which I'd encourage you to check out, we're just showing a number of different animals that are using and producing sounds in a garden landscape. So we have skunks, American robins, moles and caterpillars and grubs. Lots of these sounds and vibrations are below our hearing thresholds and hearing perception. However, there's a lot of information there that if we had the right sensor, we could potentially tap into. And we call this passive acoustics, which is a growing research area. And we can use acoustics to characterize landscapes, assess biodiversity, and basically measure acoustic complexity, and perhaps that'll give us an idea of how healthy our ecosystem is, how many animals are there, and what they're up to. And this is what I'll talk about today. Whilst yet to be fully explored below ground, acoustics is used to detect invertebrate and insect pests within a range of other crops, for example, fruit, grain and wood. And we know that invertebrates produce sounds both incidentally from moving and feeding, for example, and actively, for example, from communication. So I've got some example here of both those incidental and active sounds produced by various insects. Before I play the video, I want to explain the diagrams in each box. So we've got 3 boxes here, and within each box we've got a black or a blue waveform which is shown at the top. That shows time on the x-axis and relative amplitude on the y-axis. And below that, we have a very colourful spectrogram. That's tied in time to the waveform above, and it basically shows the frequency composition and amplitude in colour of that particular sound. As I play each video, you'll see a red vertical bar going across, which guides you through those waveform and spectrograms. So I'm going to play a few different sounds. On the top left, this is the rice weevil larvae, which is found in wheat kernels, and it's a stored product pest, and it attacks wheat, rice and maize. On the top right here, this is an example of active sound production, which is the common cockchafer larva, which is recorded in soil, which makes a stridulatory sound, which I'll play out to you, which sounds rather like a croaking sound. And at the bottom, we have a termite. So this is 300 workers feeding on a woody substrate. Again, produces a sound, and there may be a little bit of interference on that clip, so forgive me for that. I'll play them next. But how applicable is this to soil? Well, first up, we have to think what in the soil is making sound. Anything that moves, anything connecting the soil from above, for example, plant roots, and then, of course, the animals themselves. So in the photo here, I've shown some earthworms, but they're also on the left, I've shown some silhouettes just to get you thinking about what lives in soil. So spiders, woodlice, mites, and springtails, things like that. So at Cornell, we've been trying to work out whether we can gain information from listening to the soil. That would enable us to identify what animals are there, both in terms of root-feeding pests such as white grubs, but also other beneficial soil organisms such as earthworms shown in the picture here, with our ultimate aim of being able to distinguish between these using sounds. How do we measure sound stimuli in any substrate? There are a lot of different sensors to do this, and there's not one sensor but lots of different options. None of them are built for purpose. We need our sensor to be ruggedized for the field because we're going to bury or push it into the soil, either as a probe or bury it as a whole, and we need to record our sounds either onto a laptop or an audio recorder. In practice, we can use off-the-shelf sensors. So for example, accelerometers measure acceleration, geophones measure velocity, and laser Doppler vibrometers can be pointed at surfaces and measure vibration upon a surface. However, many of these are extremely expensive and none of them are made for measuring soil sounds. What can we do about that? Well, we can make our own, and so that would provide a more tailored, cost-effective monitoring strategy. So one example is the use of piezo discs. These are less than $1 each, so it's a really cost-effective method. These are typically used as guitar pickups or contact microphones, and you can see that in the top left there. So we compare these cheaper sensors, which we'll build ourselves, to a single off-the-shelf sensor to see which is best at monitoring our insect sounds. However, soils are more complex than more uniform substrates such as wood or grain. What that means is there's a high attenuation rate, which is a loss of magnitude of the sound as it travels through the soil. This is a result of absorption, scattering, and reflections at borders, and also dilution. And I've tried to show that in the photo with the red arrows here. Imagine our sound bouncing between those soil particles. Attenuation is high in the soil, particularly at higher frequencies. So that means detection of sound across distance is a challenge. And that detection varies with a number of different factors that we can measure within the soil. And I've listed them below the photo. So temperature, moisture content, compaction, organic matter, all of these things may have an influence on our sound that we measure. What this means is that the frequency composition of an insect sound changes in different substrates with distance, and so our detectability of a sound varies across an area. Unfortunately, there's a general lack of information and understanding of attenuation of sound in soils in those different conditions, because there can be so many of those different conditions, and that limits the current utility of sound as a tool below ground currently. So this is one aspect we've been looking at in particular. Before I delve into this in more detail, let's put this research into our context. So these projects at Cornell sit within a backdrop of turfgrass management and below ground pests in turf systems. So turfgrass receives regular damage by root feeding soil dwelling insect pests. So I've put on the slide here 4 species of white grubs and 2 species of crane fly. So you can see the adult beetles at the bottom. Oh, actually, cranefly isn't shown here, forgive me, but we have the species of beetles at the bottom, the adults, and at the top their associated grubs. So that's 2 different life stages of these insects. You'll see the damage of these grubs in your home lawn since they eat the roots of the grass, and eventually you'll see browning of your lawn, and eventually it dies off. And it's very clear to see that in these areas. In managed systems, turf quality is particularly important, and it's certainly important to you as a garden or a lawn owner as well, I imagine. But in these really highly managed areas such as golf courses, the appearance and the quality of the turf is really important, not only from an aesthetic point of view, so golfers don't really want to be playing on an unsightly brown golf course, but also from a playability viewpoint. So if the turf is poor quality, it'll be bumpy and our golf balls will just roll around in erratic ways, and so our playability will be affected. So typically in these managed systems, grubs are managed with the use of preventative insecticides. Often these are applied in a blanket way, so totally across one area, evenly across the whole area, regardless of having an understanding of what's there or not, so they without the knowledge of whether the pest species is present or absent, or knowledge of population size. What this means is often these applications are unnecessary, and they also impact non-pest species as well as the pest species. But if we want to get away from our blanket applications, we need to have ways to find the grubs in those areas. So to do this, we do a manual scouting approach, basically to find those scarab grubs in the turf. And once we find them, we can assess the populations prior to pesticide applications. So to do this, we can roll back the turf and physically count which grubs are there and identify them to species. The problem with this approach is it's extremely time consuming. It needs experts and training. And of course, it's invasive. It's damaging the turf to find the pest that itself is damaging the turf. So overall, there's an ecological and an economical requirement for management of these turf pests, and a need for a monitoring technique that's non-invasive, cost-effective and species-specific, which will help managers find their pests and then target them with pesticides rather than doing these blanket applications. So what if, instead of physically sampling the soil as shown in the top right, we could just listen to the turf? So this offers a potential tool as a targeted way of monitoring the soil. It doesn't require disturbing the soil to any degree, and it could help to inform our current pesticide management techniques. So I can't get the credit for this. Professor Kyle Wickens and his collaborators had this idea. They went on to get the funding from Cornell and the USDA, and then they subsequently employed me to do the research with them. So looking at that photo, I've marked some arbitrary sampling points across that putting green, and imagine that there are grubs at each one, and instead of physically sampling that soil, as you can see in the top right, we'd be putting a probe into the ground to measure the sounds. We've worked on this acoustic project in a few different ways, and I'll talk through 3 examples of acoustic monitoring at different levels of spatial scales and complexity. And the practical work for all of this has been done. The final part 3 is still a little bit in progress, but generally we have the data already ready to go, and it's kind of on my desk ready to analyse. At the beginning of this project, we did not know what, if anything, we would hear from soils. So we explored this starting from a very simple starting point. So in carefully controlled conditions, we set up boxes of different animals. So we had boxes of soil, which we grew grass in, and you can see in the photo here. And adding to each box, we added particular invertebrate species. So we listened to animals of different ecological functions. So soil engineers, earthworms, macro decomposers such as pillbugs, and root herbivores, in this case the invasive Japanese beetle grub. And we listened to each of those boxes and we scaled this up to a high level of replication, listening to each box individually to try and characterize the sounds of the box and compare these between the animals. We were dealing with low amplitude sounds, so the first step was to improve our recording conditions, which we've shown in this diagram. Put simply, we built a box within a box to minimize external acoustic noise, and we set that box on top of an anti-vibration table which floats the surface of the table using air to minimize vibration from the ground. So in the diagram here you can see one of the turf boxes in the center in green and brown, and you can see that's surrounded by the double-walled box on top of our table. And our logic here was we wanted to minimize the background noise to maximize our chances of hearing anything from our boxes. So we carried out these controlled listening experiments for a set period of time, listening to each box wired with different sensors. So what do these recordings sound like? I'm going to play them in the next few clips, starting first with earthworm. how can we quantify these sounds? The issue is we had lots of recordings and it's difficult to deal with them individually and manage them. So here at the top we have this crane fly sound shown in the left and the right, and you can see the spectra here across the whole signal and a portion of the signal. What we came up with was a way of automatically detecting fingerprints, so acoustic templates shown above in longer files using a particular software program. And so you can see these different examplers were detected by the software in a longer recording. And so basically this is a way of assessing a signal automatically and looking for a particular sound. And we can therefore say, okay, we have this long recording, but are cranefly grubs present in it? And the software would then tell us yes or no. So this is very much a work in progress. But this approach would be really useful if we took long field recordings and we wanted to process them quickly and ask the question, which animals are we hearing in this soil? So summarizing so far, we have these lab measurements in simplified boxes of animals. We have indication that we can use specific templates associated with these animals that may allow us to acoustically distinguish between them. And we can apply these templates in a kind of automated way to assess longer audio files. But there we've been working at the lowest level of complexity with those very simple soil boxes, and we needed to scale this up to more realistic levels. Because of this, we took our approach out into the field. Our focus, as I said before, is managed turf grass. So we took the project out to a few different managed turf grass scenarios. So here you can see me on the left with our sampling tools and acoustic setup, and I'll show you that in more detail later. And on the right, again, you can see our physical sampling tools for the soil on the far right, and then our acoustic setup in the foreground of the photo. However, getting out into the field, we're no longer working in our acoustically isolated box. So inherently we have noise in our systems, and this can be biological or non-biological, but certainly noise is all around us. So it could come from abiotic sources such as wind and rain. It could come from biological sources such as birds, which in this project we're not particularly interested in. The issue we have in our managed turf grass systems is these are maintained systems. So we have lawn mowers, we have leaf blowers. In the case of golf courses, we have golf course carts. And of course, we also have golfers themselves. So we chose a number of different field sites to look at this in more detail. Our first field site is Battle Island, which is a state park golf course in Fulton, New York State. This is known to have white grubs, as many courses do, but crucially they don't use chemical management, so there are plenty of grubs in their course for us to listen to. So we worked in one particular area on the course in between greens. This was still a little treacherous in terms of incoming golf balls, but on the whole it was a really nice site to work at, easily accessible to use our equipment, and we could have a golf cart to run around between different areas of the site. Our second site was Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, New York, which couldn't be any more different. This is around 470 acres of green site, and you can see the map of it in the top left. And obviously this is the center of New York City, and it's a really large urban grassland, the largest in the city, and it's known for its preservation of green space, so it's a pristine area. Because it's embedded in New York City, it has a noisy edge, but then due to its large size, it has a very quiet center. So what we have is a gradient from noisy edge to quiet center, which I've shown with the red arrows here at the top left. Inside the cemetery, it's extremely beautiful, which the photos show on the right here. But this area is carefully managed in terms of vehicles and pedestrians. So it's a very peaceful, tranquil place to work. But this noise gradient across the site allows an investigation of how acoustic monitoring varies with urban complexity. So we are basically optimizing our sensor performance and detecting our soil animals against a backdrop of varying noise. One of our first field tests was to test simply how well sound travels through soil of different moisture content, texture, organic matter and compaction. As I mentioned earlier, likely all of those parameters affect sound travelling through the soil. So in the diagram at the bottom left here, we have our acoustic source, which is a loudspeaker which is buried in a hole in the ground. We played out particular sounds through the soils, and we measured at distance, shown by the red arrows, different distances from the source, and then at the same time we physically measured our soil parameters. So things that we measured were temperature, moisture content, texture, organic matter, porosity and compaction. So this was quite time consuming and time intensive process, but the idea was to tie these parameters together to try and work out how our sound attenuated through that ground, so we can understand basically how detectable our animals are in those different soil conditions. And the data for that is sitting on my desk ready to be dealt with. The other aspect we had to cover was how to measure sounds in the soil in the field. So in the lab, we've been using accelerometers, but these are delicate pieces of kit not really made to be used in the field, and they certainly wouldn't be suitable for a turfgrass manager. With that in mind, we made a soil probe. So here we mounted guitar pickups or piezoelectric discs onto a metal bracket, and we could push that into the soil, collecting sound across its 8-inch depth. And you can see that metal bracket on the right here. At this stage, we still needed a laptop to collect our sounds onto specialized software, and you can see that on the left. And in the central picture, you can see our probe in the ground, and next to it is our expensive accelerometer, because we needed to ground truth our recordings between the test sensor and the accelerometers to see which sensor was best. Our procedure in the field was fairly simple. Across our sampling area, we recorded from random sampling points, we recorded the below and above sounds from particular points. We then physically sampled the soil to find out which soil organisms we could find and what we had recording. So to do this, we took a soil core and we put that onto a plastic tray, and we hand sorted through the soil to find the animals. And these are large enough that we can just find them by eye. So here I'll play some clips that we obtained from our field sites, including having a golf ball hitting the turf next to my recording setup, so that's a great example of noise. And then I'll play some clips of earthworms and Japanese beetle grubs as well. Since we measured those sounds across a particular area, we can look to see how those sounds varied across our area. So at the top left, this green box represents the shape of one of our sampling areas. And the top right here, this is the number of grubs we found at randomized sampling points across that green space. Below is the number of sound pulses associated with the grubs at each of those points. And so we're basically looking at whether the acoustic map at the bottom tallies up with our abundance map at the top. And what we can see is that perhaps they do tally. So we could actually measure sound instead of physically monitoring the soil and sampling the soil for our grubs. So we can use sound counts, we can look at frequency range of the sounds and amplitudes of the sounds and link those to the numbers of animals we found in the area. Summarising this so far then, I've shown an approach to monitor animals using acoustics in the lab, which we've done the data collection for. And we've shown that there are indications that acoustic signatures vary with the animals. And then we started thinking about our different complexities within soils, attenuation and physical soil measurement. For the last part of the talk, I want to talk about acoustics at a community level. So this was another grant, a particular grant we had awarded from the USDA to use our knowledge of soil sounds and apply it to a particular problem. So as I said at the beginning, we have our grubs feeding on the roots of the turf grass, but these grubs exist in a wider biological system of predator-prey interactions. So we have our grub in the photo here, and it's just below the surface and it's feeding on those roots and it's causing damage. But in turf grass, the damage from root feeding pests is further compounded by the animals which feed on them. So these predators root through the turf and they cause extensive damage, and you can see that in the photos at the bottom and the top right. This damage could be a really helpful way to locate the grub infestations, except that by the time the turf is damaged, the sod has to be repaired. So we have basically a need to manage both the white grub and their associated predator. Currently, to manage the predators, which I'm going to talk about in the next slide, the only way really involves trapping the animal and removing them, which is extremely costly and it needs professional training to do. And it's also temporary. These animals typically come back to the areas that they originally came from. So the predators of white grubs are North American raccoon and striped skunk, which I'm sure you're very familiar. We don't have either of these in the UK, so they were totally unfamiliar to me. Other predators of grubs are birds, for example the American crow, and different species of gulls. But both raccoons and skunks utilise sound and vibration already. We know this already, so raccoon paws are extremely sensitive to vibrations, and raccoons also vocalise as a way of communicating. Less is understood about skunks, but they do make sounds and they do a particular stomping behaviour which is thought to produce vibrations that may be used in some form of communication. So both of these animals may utilise acoustic, olfactory and tactile cues to locate their subterranean prey, so sound, scent and physical touch. And what we do know is that they're very accurate in localising their prey. So they'll typically go to a particular spot on the grass and they'll dig and they'll find a grub. So we already know our white grubs produce acoustic cues from that lab work, so how are those involved in the foraging of skunks and raccoons? What role do those sound cues play in the vertical foraging? Do skunks and raccoons hear the grubs below the soil, and is that how they localise them in these areas? And can we manipulate that system to interrupt the predator and prey interaction to manage that combined problem of turf grass damage from both the grub and its predator? So in this project, we're investigating the importance of sound cues in the foraging of skunks and raccoons. To do this, we'll use playback. So we'll play back sounds into the soil using tactile speakers. So these are shown in the center of those diagrams. A tactile speaker is essentially a speaker without a cone part, which maximizes vibration rather than airborne sound. We'll use our recordings of grubs from the lab to play through the soil, and we'll use trail cameras to observe the foraging behavior of skunks and raccoons. For this work, we can use Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn again. This is good for playbacks because it's carefully managed with vehicle and pedestrian activity, tightly controlled. Not only this, we have a very large population of unmanaged raccoons and a large population of skunks, so this is ideal for our work. There are different levels of management across the cemetery. There are very pristine areas, typically the newer areas, but also in the areas of the older graves, much of it is left unmanaged deliberately to encourage wildlife. In the photograph here, this is one of the older areas, and you can see this is a great example of turf damage in this less strictly managed area. You can see that there's ruffled brown areas in the turf at the centre, where both vertebrates have been foraging and grubs are destroying the turf as well. Why is this turf damage particularly an issue in cemeteries? It's unsightly, and many visitors to cemeteries find that disrespectful and would complain to the managers that it's disrespectful for those resting. And similar really to on golf courses, where it's kind of affecting the aesthetics and the playability. In our cemeteries, there is that strong aesthetic aspect, and also it gives off a kind of an air that cemetery is being neglected, which many people, of course, don't want to think about. So how can we work out if skunks and raccoons are using grub sounds to locate the grubs below the ground? Quite simply, we need to fool them with different sound treatments. So for this project, we set up plots in the turf, and they have different combinations of sound signatures. So some of the plots will be silent, some will be playing back recordings of grubs, and some will contain physical grubs, and others will be devoid of grubs. So we'll be overseeing these plots with cameras and seeing the foraging activity of the animals for each of these plots. The experiment runs overnight, which is because these animals are nocturnal, and in the morning we assess the turf damage and the number of grubs in each plot. This experiment is very much a work in progress, but if we do find that these animals are attracted to soil sounds, we can flip this on its head. We can play back acoustic signals that would drown out the natural sounds of grubs and therefore create a kind of acoustic deterrent. And this has potential as a management strategy for vertebrate damage. So instead of trying to get rid of these animals and they keep coming back, if we could play low-level sounds into the soil, that would be another way of managing them. And this management strategy would be applicable in all turf grass systems, golf courses, home lawns, city parks and cemeteries. Summarising then, we took our monitoring into a more acoustically diverse area on a larger scale. We looked at how sound may be used more widely to understand prey and predator systems, and we thought about how sound could be used as a potential deterrent, although as I said, this is kind of work in progress. So I've outlined here how acoustics can be used both passively and actively in monitoring and management in our particular system on varied spatial scales and according to a particular space or environment. Sound can be used as a monitoring tool, and it has the potential to be cost-effective and it's non-invasive, providing baseline information about particular environments. We can process the signals automatically, although we have a lot of work to do in this area. But we can use this new monitoring tool to inform decisions that are reliant on soil physical and biological parameters, leading to assessments of soil health. This can be used not only for the pests that I talk about in this talk today, but other soil-dwelling pests such as root weevil, wireworm, and corn rootworm. We can also think a lot bigger than the scale I've been talking about, and acoustic monitoring is being applied to and may be applied to a wide range of substrates, such as trees, plant stems, and stored crops. So in an agricultural context, we have a lot to explore, hence the term agro-acoustics. We can use sound to monitor bark beetles, that's already in process, shown in the photo on the right here. And we can use sounds and vibrations to disrupt mating of vineyard pests, shown in the top left. This is already happening in Italy. But we can also look at different scales. So maybe we can listen to fungal growth, or we can maybe listen to the growth of plants as well. So there's a number of different scales we can work at. Interestingly, soil sounds are getting a fair amount of attention currently. There are only a small handful of us working in this area, but we've gained quite a lot of media attention, and I've put a couple of nice summary articles here just to demonstrate that. But why are sounds in the soil gaining attention now? Well, quite simply, it's so difficult to sample these hidden environments, yet soils are essential for ecosystem health, and there's a growing recognition that they really are essential for many environments. So, of course, particularly related to crops underpinning our food production, we need to understand our soils as much as possible, and sound may offer a potential insight into that soil health. Finally, I just want to mention that plants themselves may not be quiet either. So just last week, a paper hit the headlines which measured high-frequency pops emitted by plants. And these are way above our own hearing range, so they're above 20 kilohertz, they're extremely high frequency. They're not audible by us, but they may be audible to other animals. So these plants were emitting different sounds at different stages. So when they were damaged or when they were needing water, they were producing different sounds. So again, this is another world we simply don't know anything about. With that, I would like to thank you for attending. Thank you for the questions, and thanks for bearing with this recording. And I'll now appear live so that you can talk to me properly. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Louise. That was very, very fascinating. I know a number of people who would really appreciate this, and we'll look forward to sending them a link when we have it posted online. Also want to thank Martin for facilitating all this with the Zoom process. I have a question just to start things off. I got two questions actually. One was, most of your background has been in marine acoustics, and I'm wondering how you transitioned to soils, and now that you're back in in Liverpool at the marine biology area, is that what you're doing, marine biology, or are you doing soils there? Sort of all one and a half questions. And then the other was getting into anthropogenic effects of structures on land that we're seeing more of, like wind turbines, say, and vibration from things like that affecting subsoil communities. If you could speak to that, that'd be great.
Yeah, definitely. So in answer to your first question, so for me, I've in recent years been really interested in vibrations in substrates, so either as a sound wave or as different seismic waves. And so I started off in marine biology, and then I kind of transitioned to the seabed and different substrates that are below the water. So I was kind of working on that a little bit. And then the Cornell project came up, which was focused on soils, which seemed really logical transition to me, because although it's no longer underwater, still dealing with vibrations and sounds in substrates. And in many ways, it kind of makes it, I wouldn't say easier, but kind of a bit more straightforward to research those things, because you no longer have to worry about the ocean. So you can kind of take your sensors out into the field and measure these things a little bit more easily, I suppose. So it's kind of a logical transition to me. It's also really difficult because coming from a marine background, I was then arrived at Cornell and put into the entomology department. So that was really interesting. So I was learning about insects and things like that, which I never kind of knew too much about before that. So definitely a very steep learning curve, but acoustically kind of similar to deal with as well. So that was kind of an interesting transition. And then,
I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry, go on.
No, go ahead.
And so because of the interest in vibration, so I'm interested in that in both aquatic and terrestrial systems. So structure-borne vibrations are something I haven't looked at, although here at Liverpool, actually, we have an institute and they particularly look at structure-borne sound and the impacts on humans. And so I've started collaborating with them. But of course, I'm more interested in impacts upon non-humans. So that's kind of a nice crossover between research areas. But even on land, we know obviously that humans make vibrations. Much of our construction, drilling for oil and gas and drilling for whatever, makes vibrations in the soils. And onshore wind farms, of course, through the foundations, they create a vibration in the soil which transmits fairly well. But there's actually very little research on that currently. So there was a paper a couple of years ago that showed that distributions of earthworms around onshore wind farms varied. And so there were fewer earthworms closer to the base of the turbines, and there was more further away. So they were kind of linking that to vibrational noise. But the trouble is with soil organisms, there are so many other physical factors that are influencing those animals' distributions. It's kind of hard to unpick which is the vibrational noise and which might be other factors playing a role. But it's kind of a basically untapped research area right now. And I think the problem is that as humans, we are very biased to airborne sound. So I think it's only in recent years that we've started realizing there are these vibrations in soils and other substrates that we don't detect very well, but actually other animals do detect and they may be impacted by.
I wondered if concern for subsoil critters are, and any of the work that you're doing, are showing up yet in any environmental impact statements that are being done. It sounds like probably not.
Yeah, so certainly in aquatic environments, currently vibrations in the seabed, for example, they wouldn't even include that in environmental impact assessments at all. It's completely unregulated. So any activity contacting the seabed, it can make as much vibration as possible, and there's no regulation stopping people doing that. On land, I'm not as familiar with things there, but I think vibrationally it's usually to do with impacts upon humans and not animals. So again, I'm not sure it would be included in a environmental impact assessment yet at all. It's usually just airborne sound.
When you it's a little hard to understand with your speaker, I think, but when you talked about earthworm densities in proximity to structures, did you say that they did find fewer lower densities, or that was not necessarily the case?
They found lower densities closer to the base of turbines.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what frequencies are we talking about generally? That, let's just say your insects that you've been looking at, I have no idea.
So we're talking relatively low frequency. So with our grubs, below 1000 hertz typically. Yeah, so maybe 500 to 1000 hertz.
Okay.
So rather low frequency.
Great, thank you. Any other questions out there?
I see there's one in the chat there.
Yeah, one from Vance there, right? When plants emit sounds, does this involve physical movement? Vance assuming it has to, but curious. And what part of the plant moves?
Yeah,
what part of the insect moves? I mean, yeah. A plant, sorry, I'm sorry.
Yeah. So great question. So with plants, it's likely, well, it could be any part of the plant, but it's likely water movement in the plant that's causing the cells to expand and contract, and then that would likely cause a sound. So that could be the plant stem, or it could be a leaf as it dries or unfolds, things like that. But also roots as well. So plant roots, obviously, they're moving through whatever substrate they're growing in. And so there have been sounds recorded from roots. And it's also been shown that plant roots grow towards sounds as well. So that's kind of interesting.
Okay. Anybody else out there? Doesn't sound like it. So, I guess we can wrap it up unless you'd like to add anything else. I don't think I have any other question. Well, I'll ask, is Kyle still working on this here at Cornell? And is there sort of are there a growing number of researchers getting into this over here?
Yep, Kyle's still working on it. Yeah, so the project is still running. We're kind of wrapping it up. But yes, he is still working on it, and he's very interested in earthworm sounds and vibrations right now. So that might be one way that the project goes. But they have all the sensors and everything set up from when I was at Cornell, so they're going to carry on for a little bit longer and see where it goes. And our idea actually is to write grants together now, so it will hopefully be a collaboration between Cornell and myself at Liverpool, which is kind of exciting as well.
Great, great. Do you know Chris Clark from Marine
Yes,
Acoustics?
I haven't met him in person, but we've emailed, yes.
So he was a speaker of ours a couple of years ago, I think, and we really got into the whole issue of shipping noises, right?
Mhm.
And I just wonder if, in your experience, most people are talking about shipping noises on marine mammals now, and of course, in New England, the right whale and so forth, and he had some great stuff about whales in the proximity of ship traffic coming into Boston Harbor. But anyone done anything about shipping lanes and subsurface soil, or strata at all, and looking at
Yes,
population densities of anything,
so one of my focuses has been looking at impacts upon fish and invertebrates, and particularly in invertebrates that burrow in the seabed or live on the seabed. And again, it's another area that most of the focus has been marine mammals. So we know quite a lot about their responses to various noise signatures, but there's really been not very much research looking at fish and invertebrates. So right now, we don't really know what the effects of those noises are. We have a kind of vague idea that they can kind of have a behavioral response, or some very loud noises can cause physical damage. But the number of species of invertebrates and fish that we've actually researched so far is very, very small compared to what we know about marine mammals. So we have a lot more research to do on that. So we can't even really say shipping noise has this effect. We can sort of say more broadly that noise as a whole may have this effect, but we can't really be much more specific than that at this stage. But that's an area that is growing. People are gaining interest in that area, and more research is being done. But it's been kind of slow progress so far.
Okay. Sandy jumped in here with a question about golf courses, and if you've seen, if basically are people using the technique at all yet, and are seeing a reduction in or efforts to reduce or eliminate pesticides?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So many managers are very open to the possibility of reducing pesticides, which is brilliant. In terms of using sound, right now it's still very novel, and we've got a lot of things to iron out before that would be a good tool for them to use. But they certainly can do other things. So for example, they can identify the grubs, and they can go on training courses to help them and identify the different species. And they can be trained on how to find the hotspots on their courses, and that will allow them to reduce their pesticide amount a little bit. And many managers are extremely open to learning all those things. The problem is that obviously they've got a lot to manage and not much time to do it in. So there's kind of that balancing act, really.
Are the two study areas that you used, the golf course upstate a little bit, and the Brooklyn Cemetery, are they doing anything with this now?
Not yet, no, but we'll see where it goes in the future, really. It's definitely in our hands to make a tool that they would feel comfortable using, that's kind of easy enough for anyone to use and put into the ground. And that's kind of the next phase of the project, really.
Yes. So what you're playing with mostly seem, were more or less static deployments of sensors. Um, is that the way it has to be, would you say, versus, a metal detector, like, some sort of an acoustic detector running along near the surface? Is that even a possibility without getting in to pick up the vibrations or not?
So, well, I guess the ideal thing would be kind of an array of sensors across an area.
Mhm.
The difficulty is with many of these managed turf areas is that they have a lot of maintenance requirements. So you can't really leave sensors in the ground because they have kind of water lines and they have mowers regularly. And then of course you have, in the case of golf courses, you have golfers as well. So I think whatever tool it ends up being, it has to be kind of movable. But the ultimate way would be to have a kind of massive network of sensors measuring sounds all the time. And then you could just kind of download the data and interpret that in terms of a map of some kind. But I guess it's kind of working out what's feasible in those environments. And that's kind of the tricky thing.
Yeah.
And so we definitely have a long way to go on that.
Seems like they'd have to be underground to avoid, getting caught in the lawnmowers, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
And
Exactly.
even then, they're going to get frost heaved up, over time. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, hearing no more questions, seeing no more questions, last chance, gone, right? So thank you so much again for being here. And this is the first time again that we've had someone from across the sea with us, and we really appreciate the effort. I should say that you weren't there when I first contacted you. You were here. So we caught you just before the move, and then now you've moved back. So we appreciate you doing this, and I appreciate this, especially with the time change. So thank you, and thank you, Martin, again, and thank you all for coming. And again, join us if you have any interest in history. Jay is an awesome presenter, and we'll be at May 10th talking about Pelham, and then on the following night we'll have this wonderful kids program that they helped write and performed and did all kinds of work on this film, history film on the town of Bowdoin. And so thank you. We'll
Brilliant. Thanks for having me. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, all right. And we hope to have, I'll send you a note in a couple of days when Martin has this posted, and then you can send people to the link if you want to, and so forth. All right. Good night. Good night, everybody.